Alyssa Rodriguez never imagined that a simple act of kindness would bring a billionaire to her humble diner. When she spotted a homeless teenager digging through the restaurant's dumpster after her late shift, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The girl was dirty, desperate, and clearly hadn't eaten in days, but there was something about her eyes that spoke of a different world entirely. 24 hours later, a black Mercedes with tinted windows pulled up outside Murphy's family diner, and out stepped one of the most powerful men in media. He had one request: to speak with the waitress who had shown his missing daughter, the only genuine kindness she'd experienced in months. But what he was about to offer Alyssa would test everything she believed about luck, destiny, and the power of treating every person with dignity, no matter their circumstances. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's family diner cast their familiar harsh glow across the worn linoleum floor as Alyssa Rodriguez wiped down the last table of her double shift. Her feet ached in her second-hand sneakers, and the smell of grease and coffee had long since embedded itself into her uniform. At 26, she had been working at the diner for 3 years, ever since her mother's medical bills had forced her to drop out of nursing school. The dreams of helping people in hospitals had been replaced by the reality of serving them pancakes and burgers, but Alyssa had never lost her instinct to care for others. The clock above the register showed 11:47 p.m., and the last customer had left over an hour ago. Frank Murphy, the owner, had already headed home to his family, leaving Alyssa to lock up as she often did. The routine was second nature by now, counting the register, cleaning the coffee machine, checking that the grill was properly turned off. She moved through these tasks with practiced efficiency, her mind already shifting toward home, where her small apartment waited with a stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. As she gathered the day's leftover food, a practice Frank encouraged to reduce waste, Alyssa found herself with an unusually large amount. A family had ordered 3 full dinners, but left before their food arrived, citing a family emergency. The meals sat untouched under the heat lamps, perfectly good food that would otherwise end up in the dumpster behind the restaurant. Alyssa carefully packed them into containers, thinking she might drop them off at the homeless shelter on 5th Street if it wasn't too late. The November air bit at her exposed arms as she stepped out the back door, fumbling for her keys while balancing the containers of food. The alley behind Murphy's was dimly lit by a single streetlight that flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the brick walls. As she approached her aging Honda Civic, a sound made her freeze. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but distinctly human. A soft rustling followed by what sounded like suppressed tears. Turning toward the dumpster, Alyssa's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she saw her. A girl, probably 16 or 17, was crouched beside the large metal container, her thin frame barely visible in the shadows. She wore an oversized jacket that had seen better days, and her dark hair hung in matted strings around her face. In her hands, she held what appeared to be a half-eaten sandwich, examining it carefully before taking a tentative bite. Alyssa's heart clenched at the sight. She had seen homeless individuals in the area before, but something about this girl struck her differently. Despite the dirt and desperation, there was an elegance to her features, a refinement that seemed at odds with her current circumstances. Her hands, though dirty, had the long fingers of someone who might once have played piano, and even in her bedraggled state, she carried herself with a posture that spoke of different origins. "Hey," Alyssa called out softly, not wanting to startle the girl. "Are you okay?" The teenager's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear and embarrassment. She scrambled to her feet, ready to run, but something in Alyssa's gentle tone made her pause. Those eyes, Alyssa noticed, were a striking shade of green, intelligent and alert despite the exhaustion that marked her young face. "I'm sorry," the girl stammered, her voice carrying traces of an accent that Alyssa couldn't quite place. "I wasn't taking anything valuable, I was just looking for something to eat. I'll leave. I won't cause any trouble." "No, wait," Alyssa said quickly, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "You don't need to apologize. When was the last time you had a real meal?" The girl's eyes darted away, shame coloring her pale cheeks. I don't remember exactly. Maybe 2 days ago? There was a church that gave out sandwiches, but I couldn't find it again. Alyssa looked down at the containers in her hands, then back at the girl who was clearly trying to maintain her dignity, despite her desperate situation. What's your name? Sophie. The girl replied after a moment's hesitation. Sophie Laura. I'm Alyssa. She held up the containers. Sophie, I have some food here that's perfectly good, but it's just going to be thrown away. Would you like it? There's enough for several meals. Sophie's eyes widened, and for a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked. You would do that? For me? Of course, Alyssa said, surprised by the question. Why wouldn't I? The simple response seemed to overwhelm Sophie, and tears began to flow down her dirt-streaked cheeks. Most people, they look at me like I'm dangerous, or like I'm not even there at all. The police chase me away from doorways. Shop owners yell at me for standing too close to their windows. No one has offered me kindness in so long. Alyssa felt her own eyes beginning to water as she approached slowly, extending the containers towards Sophie. Well, that changes now. This is yours. Sophie accepted the food with trembling hands, holding the containers as if they were made of gold. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea what this means to me. Are you staying somewhere safe? Alyssa asked, concern evident in her voice. The November nights were getting cold, and Sophie's jacket, while large, didn't look warm enough for the dropping temperatures. I found a place under the bridge by the river, Sophie replied. It's not much, but it keeps the wind off. Alyssa frowned. She knew the area Sophie was describing, and it was neither safe nor warm. Listen, I don't have much, but I have a couch in my apartment. If you want somewhere warm to sleep tonight, you're welcome to it. The offer hung in the air between them, and Alyssa could see Sophie wrestling with the decision. On one hand, she was clearly desperate for warmth and safety. On the other, accepting help from a stranger was a risk she had probably learned to avoid during her time on the streets. That's very kind, Sophie said finally, but I couldn't impose. You've already done so much. The offer stands, Alyssa said gently. But I understand if you're not comfortable with it. Do you have a phone? Any way to contact family? Sophie's expression darkened, and she shook her head. My family, they don't want me anymore. I made some choices they couldn't forgive, said some things I can't take back. I thought I could make it on my own, but, she gestured at her current state, I'm not doing very well. Alyssa sensed there was much more to Sophie's story than the girl was sharing, but she didn't press. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, one of her tips from the evening. Take this too. It's not much, but maybe it will help. I can't take your money, Sophie protested, even as her eyes fixed on the bill with obvious longing. You're not taking it, Alyssa said firmly, pressing the money into Sophie's free hand. I'm giving it to you. There's a difference. Sophie stared at the bill for a long moment, then looked up at Alyssa with an expression of wonder and gratitude. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Alyssa considered the question, thinking about her own struggles, her mother's illness, the dreams she had put on hold. Because everyone deserves kindness, she said simply. Because you're a human being, and human beings look out for each other. At least, they should. The two women stood in the flickering light of the street lamp, an unlikely pair connected by a moment of genuine human compassion. Sophie clutched the food and money as if they were lifelines, while Alyssa felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the mild November evening. I come off shift around the same time most nights, Alyssa said. If you're in the area and hungry, find me, okay? Sophie nodded, tears still flowing but accompanied now by the faintest hint of a smile. Thank you, Alyssa. I won't forget this. As Alyssa drove home that night, she found herself thinking about Sophie, wondering about her story, and hoping she would find somewhere warm and safe to sleep. The girl's refined speech and mannerisms suggested brav, an education and upbringing that didn't match her current circumstances. Whatever had led her to the streets must have been significant, and Alyssa's heart ached thinking about what Sophie might have endured. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical November weather that seemed to seep cold into every corner of the city. Alyssa arrived at Murphy's at her usual time, 6 a.m., to help with the breakfast rush. Frank was already there, as he had been every morning for the past 15 years, preparing the grill and brewing the first pot of coffee. "Morning, Alyssa?" he called out as she tied her apron. "You look tired. Everything okay?" "Just a long night," she replied, not elaborating on her encounter with Sophie. Frank was a good man, but he ran a business, and she wasn't sure how he would react to learning she had been giving away food to homeless individuals. The morning passed in its usual blur of coffee refills, breakfast orders, and small talk with regular customers. Murphy's attracted a diverse crowd, from construction workers grabbing quick meals before job sites opened, to business people who preferred the diner's honest food to the sterile atmosphere of corporate cafeterias. Alyssa had always enjoyed the variety, the brief glimpses into different lives that came with serving food to people from all walks of life. Around 10 a.m., as the breakfast rush was winding down, Alyssa noticed an unusual commotion outside. Several customers had paused their conversations to stare out the large front windows, and she could hear murmured comments about an expensive car. Curiosity getting the boss better of her. She glanced outside and felt her breath catch in her throat. Parked directly in front of Murphy's family diner was a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, the kind of vehicle that probably cost more than she made in 3 years. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside, but the car's very presence seemed to transform the shabby street. Other drivers slowed as they passed, craning their necks to get a better look, and pedestrians gathered at a respectful distance, phones already out to capture photos. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank muttered, coming to stand beside Alyssa at the window. "Don't see many of those around here. Wonder who it is." Before Alyssa could respond, the rear door of the Mercedes opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, probably in his early 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair that was perfectly styled despite the drizzle. His suit was clearly expensive, tailored to perfection, and even from a distance, there was an unmistakable aura of power and confidence about him. He moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command, someone who was used to having doors opened and paths cleared. Behind him emerged another figure that made Alyssa's heart skip, a tall man in a dark suit who was clearly security, followed by a third individual who appeared to be an assistant of some kind, notebook in hand, and phone pressed to his ear. The entire entourage moved toward Murphy's front door, with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this many times before. "Holy cow," whispered Janet, the other waitress on duty. "That's got to be someone famous. Should we call the papers?" "Let's just see what they want first," Frank said, though his voice carried a note of excitement that he was trying to suppress. "Alyssa, you take their table. You're better with the, distinguished customers." Alyssa nodded, smoothing her apron and checking her hair in the reflection of the coffee machine. Her heart was beating faster than normal, though she couldn't quite explain why. There was something about the careful, deliberate way the man had exited the vehicle that suggested this wasn't a random stop for breakfast. The bell above the door chimed as the 3 men entered, and the diner fell into an unusual silence. Even the regulars, who usually paid little attention to anything beyond their morning coffee and newspapers, looked up with curiosity. The man in the expensive suit surveyed the interior of Murphy's with sharp, intelligent eyes, taking in the worn vinyl booths, the checkerboard floor, and the handwritten specials board as if he were memorizing every detail. "Good morning," he said, approaching the counter where Alyssa waited. His voice was cultured and precise, with the faintest trace of an accent that sounded vaguely European. "I'm looking for someone who works here." A waitress named Alyssa. The request sent a chill down Alyssa's spine. This man, whoever he was, had come here specifically for her. She couldn't imagine why. Couldn't think of any reason why someone of his obvious wealth and status would know her name, let alone seek her out at her place of work. "I'm Alyssa," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "How can I help you?" The man's expression softened slightly, and something that might have been relief flickered across his features. "My name is Alexander Laurent," he said. "I believe you met my daughter last night." The words hit Alyssa like a physical blow. Laurent, Sophie Laurent, the homeless girl she had helped behind the diner, was the daughter of this obviously wealthy and powerful man. The implications began to cascade through her mind, each more confusing than the last. How had Sophie ended up on the streets? Why hadn't her father found her before now? And how had he connected Alyssa to his daughter's situation? Sophie, Alyssa said quietly, the name barely audible above the sudden ringing in her ears. Yes, Alexander confirmed, his eyes never leaving her face. I've been searching for her for 3 months. Yesterday, I finally received information about where she might be, and I've been driving through this area since dawn. I found her about an hour ago, sleeping under the Riverside Bridge. Alyssa's heart clenched at the image. Despite her offer of a warm place to stay, Sophie had chosen to return to the cold, dangerous area under the bridge. She wondered if the girl had simply been too afraid to trust a stranger, or if there were other factors at play. Is she okay? Alyssa asked. She's safe now, Alexander replied. She's in the car actually, though it took considerable persuasion to get her to come with me. She's been through a difficult time, and trust doesn't come easily to her anymore. The businessman glanced around the diner, noting the curious stares of the other customers, then looked back at Alyssa. I was wondering if we might speak privately. What you did for Sophie last night. It was the first kindness she had experienced in months. I'd like to thank you properly. Frank, who had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement, stepped forward. Of course, he said quickly. Alyssa, why don't you take your break? Use the back office if you need privacy. But Alexander shook his head. Actually, I was hoping Miss Rodriguez might join me for lunch. There's a restaurant not far from here, where we could speak more comfortably. Alyssa looked down at her uniform, suddenly conscious of the coffee stains and wrinkles that marked her morning's work. I don't think I'm dressed appropriately for wherever you have in mind. You're dressed perfectly, Alexander said with a slight smile. The restaurant I'm thinking of values character over clothing. Besides, what you did for my daughter tells me everything I need to know about who you are. Frank practically pushed Alyssa toward the door. Go, he insisted. Take the whole afternoon if you need to. Janet and I can handle things here. Still somewhat stunned by the rapid turn of events, Alyssa found herself walking toward the gleaming Mercedes. As they approached the vehicle, she could see a figure in the back seat, and her heart went out to Sophie once again. Even through the tinted windows, the girl looked small and fragile, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. Alexander opened the door for Alyssa, a courtesy that felt strange after years of opening doors for others. As she slid into the luxurious interior, she was struck by the contrast between this moment and the previous evening. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been handing leftovers to a desperate teenager in a dark alley. Now, she was sitting in a vehicle worth more than she would earn in several years, about to have lunch with what was clearly a very powerful man. Sophie looked up as Alyssa settled into the seat beside her, and their eyes met with a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. The girl had been cleaned up since the night before, her hair washed and brushed, her face free of dirt. But she still wore the same oversized jacket and the same expression of uncertainty. Hello again, Alyssa said gently. Hi, Sophie replied quietly. I'm sorry I didn't take you up on your offer last night. I wasn't sure if I could trust. I didn't know if it was safe. You don't need to apologize, Alyssa assured her. I understand completely. Alexander settled into the seat across from them as the driver smoothly pulled away from the curb. Sophie told me what you did, he said to Alyssa. She said you were the first person in months to treat her like a human being rather than a problem to be solved or avoided. Alyssa looked between father and daughter, noting the careful distance they maintained even while sitting in the same vehicle. Whatever had driven Sophie to the streets had clearly created a rift that wouldn't be easily healed. Anyone would have done the same thing, Alyssa said. No, Alexander replied firmly. They wouldn't have. Over the past 3 months, I've had private investigators canvassing the areas where Sophie was living. They spoke to dozens of people, business owners, other homeless individuals, social workers. You were the only one who showed her genuine kindness without expecting anything in return. The Mercedes pulled up in front of a small bistro that Alyssa recognized but had never entered. Antoine's was the kind of restaurant that catered to the city's elite. the type of place where reservations were made weeks in advance, and meals cost more than she typically spent on groceries in a month. She felt a flutter of nervousness as they exited the vehicle, but Alexander's calm confidence seemed to smooth their way. The maitre d' recognized Alexander immediately, greeting him by name and leading them to a quiet corner table without being asked. As they settled into the comfortable chairs, Alyssa couldn't help but marvel at the seamless efficiency with which Alexander moved through this world of privilege and power. "Order anything you'd like," Alexander said, handing her a menu. "This conversation is important to me, and I want you to be comfortable." As they looked over the menus, Alexander began to share Sophie's story, with his daughter occasionally adding quiet corrections or details. The tale that emerged was both heartbreaking and complex, a story of family expectations, teenage rebellion, and the dangerous consequences of pride and miscommunication. Sophie had grown up in a world of extraordinary privilege. Alexander Laurent was the founder and CEO of Laurent Media Group, a global empire that encompassed television networks, publishing houses, and digital platforms. With a net worth estimated in the billions, he was accustomed to solving problems with resources and connections, to having his decisions respected and his authority unquestioned. Sophie, however, had inherited her father's strong will, along with his intelligence, and as she entered her teenage years, the conflicts between them had escalated. She had wanted to pursue art and music, while he had envisioned her eventually joining the family business. She had friends he disapproved of, interests he didn't understand, and a growing resentment of the protective bubble that surrounded her life. "I felt like I was suffocating," Sophie explained quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "Every decision was made for me. Every friend was investigated. Every school was chosen based on what would look best for the family image. I wanted to know what real life was like, what it felt like to make my own choices and face the consequences." The breaking point had come during a particularly heated argument about Sophie's college plans. She had been accepted to several prestigious universities, but she wanted to take a gap year to travel and explore her artistic interests. Alexander, concerned about her safety and her future, had refused to consider the idea. "I told her that her job was to be a student, to prepare herself for the responsibilities she would inherit," Alexander said, regret clear in his voice. "I thought I was protecting her, setting her up for success. I didn't realize I was pushing her away." The argument had escalated beyond anything they had experienced before. Sophie, feeling cornered and desperate to assert her independence, had said things designed to hurt her father as deeply as possible. She had accused him of caring more about his business image than his daughter's happiness, of trying to turn her into a puppet who would smile and perform for the cameras but never have thoughts or dreams of her own. "I told him I hated him," Sophie admitted, tears beginning to flow again. "I told him I wished I had been born into a different family, that I would rather be poor and free than rich and trapped. I said I never wanted to see him again." Alexander had responded with equal anger, telling Sophie that if she was so eager to experience life without his support, she was welcome to try. It was a challenge issued in the heat of the moment, one that both father and daughter would come to regret. But by then the words had been spoken, and teenage pride had taken hold. That night, Sophie had packed a single bag and left the family's estate. She had intended to prove her point, to show her father that she could indeed survive and thrive on her own terms. She had some money saved from birthday gifts and allowances, and she had been confident that she could find work and make her own way in the world. "Ah, I thought it would be easy," Sophie said with a bitter laugh. "I thought people would see that I was smart and capable and give me a chance. I had no idea how much my father's name and money had protected me from the reality of how difficult life could be." The money had run out faster than she had expected. Without identification documents, which she had left behind in her haste to leave, finding legitimate employment had proved nearly impossible. The few jobs she had managed to secure, washing dishes or cleaning offices under the table, had barely provided enough for basic survival. As weeks turned into months, Sophie's situation had deteriorated rapidly. She had been too proud to contact her father, convinced that doing so would prove his point about her inability to manage on her own. She had told herself repeatedly that she just needed more time, that she would figure things out and eventually return home triumphant. I kept thinking I would find a way to make it work, Sophie explained. I thought that if I could just hold on a little longer, I would prove to myself and to him that I was strong enough to make my own decisions. But every day it got harder, and I got hungrier. And I started to realize that maybe I had made a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, Alexander had been searching for her with increasing desperation. His anger had faded within days of Sophie's departure, replaced by worry and regret over the harsh words they had exchanged. He had hired private investigators, reached out to law enforcement, and used every resource at his disposal to locate his daughter. I realized that I had been so focused on protecting her future that I had forgotten to value her present, Alexander said. She was right about many things. I had been trying to control her life, instead of helping her discover who she wanted to become. The search had been complicated by Sophie's deliberate attempts to avoid detection. She had changed her appearance, used only cash, and avoided areas where she might be recognized. For 3 months, she had managed to stay one step ahead of the investigators, moving from shelter to shelter, bridge to bridge, surviving on a combination of stubbornness, intelligence, and sheer luck. What changed? Alyssa asked. How did you finally find her? Alexander smiled slightly. Sophie got sick. She developed a bad cough that wouldn't go away, and she finally went to a free clinic for treatment. She had to give them a name, and even though she used an alias, one of the nurses recognized her from a missing person poster. The clinic called the police, who contacted me. End quote. I was so weak by then, Sophie added. I hadn't eaten a real meal in days, and I was starting to realize that pride wasn't going to keep me warm or fed. When the nurse asked if I wanted them to call someone for me, I almost said yes. But then I thought about facing Dad after everything I had said, after proving that he was right about me not being able to take care of myself, and I just couldn't do it. The story continued to unfold over their meal, painting a picture of a family torn apart by love and fear and miscommunication. Alexander described the agony of not knowing whether his daughter was safe, of imagining the worst-case scenarios that played out in his mind during sleepless nights. Sophie talked about the reality of life on the streets, the constant hunger and cold, the way people looked through her as if she didn't exist. That's why what you did meant so much, Sophie said to Alyssa. You looked at me and saw a person. You didn't try to fix me or save me or judge me. You just offered me food and kindness, like I was worth caring about. Alyssa felt tears pricking her eyes as she listened to the pain in both their voices. You are worth caring about, she said simply. Both of you are. And it sounds like you both learned important things about yourselves and each other. Alexander nodded slowly. I've realized that my role as Sophie's father isn't to make all her decisions for her. It's to provide her with the tools and support she needs to make good decisions for herself. That includes accepting that some of those decisions might be different from what I would choose. End quote. And I've learned that independence doesn't mean cutting yourself off from everyone who cares about you, Sophie added. Real strength sometimes means accepting help when you need it and admitting when you've made mistakes. As their lunch continued, the conversation gradually shifted from the painful past to possibilities for the future. Alexander spoke about his plans to establish a foundation focused on helping homeless youth, inspired by what he had learned during the search for Sophie. Sophie talked tentatively about her interest in social work, about wanting to use her experience to help other young people who found themselves in desperate situations. I want to do something meaningful with my life, Sophie said. Something that makes a difference for people who don't have the advantages I was born with. That sounds like a worthy goal, Alexander replied, and Alyssa could hear the pride and support in his voice. We can discuss what kind of education and training would help you achieve it. As they talked, Alyssa began to understand that she was witnessing something remarkable, the rebuilding of a relationship that had been broken by fear and pride. Both father and daughter were approaching each other with new humility and respect, recognizing the ways they had both contributed to the crisis that had nearly destroyed their family. I have a question for you, Alyssa, Alexander said as they finished their meal. What you did for Sophie, it came naturally to you, didn't it? Seeing someone in need and wanting to help? I suppose so, Alyssa replied. My mother always taught me that we're all just human beings trying to get by, and sometimes we need to look out for each other. Alexander exchanged a glance with Sophie, who nodded encouragingly. I've been thinking about the foundation I mentioned, the one focused on helping homeless youth. It's going to need people who understand the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. People who can see past circumstances to the individual underneath. Alyssa felt her heart begin to beat faster as she sensed where the conversation was heading. I'm wondering if you might be interested in a position with the foundation, Alexander continued. It would involve outreach work, connecting with young people on the streets, helping them access resources and support. It's not easy work, and it requires someone with both compassion and practical skills. The offer hung in the air between them, and Alyssa felt her mind racing as she tried to process what she was hearing. A job with a foundation backed by a billionaire. Work that would allow her to help people in meaningful ways. The chance to use her natural instincts for caring in a professional context. What kind of position are we talking about? She asked carefully. Director of Outreach Services, Alexander replied. You would be responsible for developing and implementing programs to identify and assist homeless youth. The salary would be competitive, and you would have significant resources at your disposal to create the kind of programs you think would be most effective. End quote. Alyssa's eyes widened at the title and the implications. I don't have experience running programs like that. I'm just a waitress. You're a person who saw someone in need and helped them without expecting anything in return, Sophie interjected. You treated me like I mattered when everyone else acted like I was invisible. That's exactly the kind of person this foundation needs. Alexander nodded in agreement. Experience can be gained, credentials can be earned, but the fundamental character that drives someone to act with compassion, that's something you either have or you don't. You have it. I would need to think about it, Alyssa said, though her heart was already leaning toward yes. This is all happening very fast. Of course, Alexander said. Take all the time you need, but I hope you'll consider it seriously. Sophie and I have discussed this extensively, and we both believe you would be perfect for the role. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Alexander handed Alyssa a business card with his personal contact information. Call me when you've made your decision, he said. And thank you again for what you did for Sophie. You saved more than just her life, you helped save our family. The ride back to Murphy's passed in a blur of thoughts and emotions. Alyssa found herself staring out the window at the city streets, seeing them with new eyes as she thought about all the people who might be struggling, all the Sophies who were looking for someone to treat them with basic human dignity. As the Mercedes pulled up in front of the diner, Sophie reached over and squeezed Alyssa's hand. Whatever you decide about the job, I want you to know that what you did mattered. You reminded me that there are good people in the world, people who care about strangers just because they're fellow human beings. You reminded me of the same thing, Alyssa replied. Sometimes, we all need to remember that everyone has a story. Everyone deserves compassion. Alexander walked Alyssa to the door of the diner, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by who were clearly wondering what a waitress was doing with such an obviously wealthy and important man. I meant what I said about taking your time with the decision, he told her. But I hope you'll say yes. The foundation needs someone like you, and I think you might find the work rewarding in ways you haven't imagined. That evening, as Alyssa sat in her small apartment surrounded by the familiar sounds of her neighborhood, she found herself thinking about the extraordinary day she had just experienced. 24 hours ago, she had been worried about paying her bills and wondering if she would ever be able to finish nursing school. Now, she was considering a job offer that would not only solve her financial problems, but give her the opportunity to help people on a scale she had never dreamed possible. She thought about Sophie, about the transformation from the desperate girl digging through garbage to the thoughtful young woman who had sat across from her at lunch. She thought about Alexander, about the pain in his eyes when he described the months of not knowing whether his daughter was safe, and the relief when he talked about their reconciliation. Most of all, she thought about the simple act that had started it all, seeing someone in need and responding with kindness. It hadn't felt heroic at the time, it had felt like the most natural thing in the world. But apparently, that simple, natural response had been extraordinary enough to change multiple lives forever. The next morning, Alyssa arrived at Murphy's with a new sense of purpose. She went through her usual routine, but now she found herself really seeing the customers in a way she hadn't before. The construction worker, who always ordered his coffee black and rarely spoke, might be dealing with family problems at home. The businesswoman who seemed perpetually stressed might be struggling with challenges that weren't visible on the surface. During her break, Alyssa called the number on Alexander's business card. He answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting for her call. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said without preamble. "And?" Alexander's voice was hopeful but patient. "I want to accept, but I have some conditions." "Name them." "I want to start small, with a pilot program that focuses on building trust with homeless youth, rather than trying to fix everything at once. I want to work directly with the people we're trying to help, not just make decisions about them from an office. And I want Sophie involved, if she's willing, because she understands this population in a way that I never could." There was a pause, and then Alexander's voice came back warm with approval. "Those sound like exactly the right conditions. When can you start?" 6 months later, Alyssa stood in the converted warehouse that served as headquarters for the Laurent Foundation's youth outreach program. The space buzzed with activity as counselors, social workers, and volunteers worked with young people who had found their way off the streets. Sophie, now enrolled in social work classes at the local university, spent her afternoons at the center, sharing her story with teens who were struggling with similar situations. The program had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had started as Alyssa's vision of building trust through simple human connection had evolved into a comprehensive support network. They provided not just immediate needs like food and shelter, but also job training, educational support, and most importantly, the kind of dignity and respect that Alyssa had shown Sophie that night behind Murphy's Diner. "We have 17 young people in our job placement program this month," reported Marcus Chen, the program coordinator Alyssa had hired after meeting him during an outreach visit to the downtown shelters. Marcus himself had been homeless as a teenager, and his combination of lived experience and social work education made him invaluable in connecting with their clients. Alyssa nodded as she reviewed the monthly statistics, but her attention was drawn to the individual stories behind the numbers. There was Jessica, who had aged out of foster care and found herself sleeping in her car until the outreach team connected with her. Now she was working as a receptionist at a veterinary clinic and saving money for community college. There was David, who had fled an abusive home situation and spent months surviving on the streets before finding his way to the foundation. He was now Baraf, living in their transitional housing program, and had just gotten his GED, the approach that Alyssa had advocated from the beginning. Treating each person as an individual with unique needs and circumstances, rather than a problem to be solved, had proven remarkably effective. The foundation's retention rates were significantly higher than similar BEAD programs, and more importantly, the young people they worked with reported feeling valued and respected throughout the process. "The City Council wants to meet with you next week about expanding the program," Marcus continued. "They're impressed with the outcomes we're achieving and want to discuss additional funding." "That's wonderful news," Alyssa replied, though she felt the familiar flutter of nerves that accompanied public speaking engagements. 6 months ago, she had been serving coffee and pancakes. Now she was being asked to present program data to government officials and community leaders. The transition hadn't always been smooth, but Alexander had made sure she had access to training and mentorship that helped her grow into the role. Sophie appeared at Alyssa's office door, her face bright with excitement. "Alyssa, you need to come see this. We just had a breakthrough with Maria." Alyssa followed Sophie to the common area, where a 17-year-old girl sat surrounded by art supplies, working intently on a canvas. Maria had been with the program for 2 months, but had remained largely silent despite the staff's gentle encouragement. She had aged out of foster care and was struggling with severe anxiety and depression that made it difficult for her to engage with others. "She asked for art supplies yesterday," Sophie whispered, "and she's been painting for hours. Look at what she's created." The canvas showed a bird in flight, its wings spread wide against a sky that transitioned from dark storm clouds to brilliant sunshine. The technique was raw, but emotionally powerful, and the symbolism was unmistakable. It was a visual representation of hope, of movement from darkness toward light. "It's beautiful," Alyssa said softly, approaching Maria's table. "You're incredibly talented." Maria looked up, her eyes still cautious, but showing more life than Alyssa had seen before. "I used to paint all the time," she said quietly, "before everything got complicated. I forgot how much I missed it." "Would you be interested in taking some art classes?" Alyssa asked. "The community college has an excellent program, and we could help you get enrolled." For the first time since arriving at the center, Maria smiled. "I would like that very much." As Alyssa watched Maria return to her painting, she felt the deep satisfaction that had become familiar over the past months. This was why she had accepted Alexander's offer. For moments like this, when a young person rediscovered hope and possibility in their life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Board meeting moved to Thursday. Can you attend? They want to hear about the expansion plans." Alyssa typed back her confirmation, still amazed at how naturally she had adapted to communicating with billionaires and board members. The foundation's board included some of the most powerful people in the city, but she had learned that when it came to discussing the program's work, her passion and expertise commanded their respect regardless of her background. That evening, as Alyssa was preparing to leave the center, she found Sophie in the break room, going over notes from her social work class. "How are things going with school?" Alyssa asked, settling into a chair beside her. "Really well," Sophie replied, closing her textbook. "Professor Williams says I have a natural understanding of trauma-informed care practices. She thinks my personal experience gives me insights that are valuable in this field." "She's right," Alyssa said. "You connect with our clients in ways that textbook knowledge alone couldn't achieve." Sophie was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Alyssa with an expression of gratitude that had become familiar but never failed to move her. "I've been thinking about that night we met. If you hadn't stopped to help me, if you hadn't treated me like I mattered, I don't know where I would be right now." "You would have found your way," Alyssa said gently. "You're stronger than you knew then." "Maybe," Sophie said, "but it would have taken longer, and it would have been much harder. What you did that night, it wasn't just about food or money. You reminded me that I was still a person worth caring about. That's what saved me." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus, who appeared in the doorway with a concerned expression. "Alyssa, we just got a call from the police. They found a group of kids sleeping under the Riverside Bridge, the same area where we found Sophie. 3 teenagers, and they're asking specifically for help from our program." Alyssa felt her heart clench at the mention of the bridge where Sophie had been living. "Are they willing to come in tonight?" "The officers think so, but they're scared. They'd had bad experiences with authority figures before. I was thinking maybe Sophie and I should go talk to them, let them know that we understand what they're going through." "I'm coming too," Alyssa said, already reaching for her jacket. "Let's take some food and blankets." An hour later, the 3 of them stood at the edge of the bridge area, flashlights in hand as they looked for the teenagers the police had described. The November night was cold and damp, reminding Alyssa viscerally of the conditions Sophie had endured for months. "Over here?" Sophie called softly, her voice carrying the gentle tone she had developed for approaching frightened young people. Huddled beneath a concrete overhang were 3 teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, all appearing to be around 16 or 17 years old. They looked up warily as the team approached, clearly ready to run if necessary. "Hi," Sophie said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm Sophie, and these are my friends Alyssa and Marcus. We're from the Laurent Foundation Youth Center. We heard you might be looking for some help." One of the boys, thin and pale with prematurely aged eyes, spoke for the group. "The cops said you guys were different, that you actually help people instead of just moving them along." "We try to," Alyssa said, stepping forward slowly. "What are your names?" "I'm Jake," the boy replied. "This is Tommy and Sarah." He gestured to his companions, who remained silent but watchful. "Are you guys hungry?" Sophie asked, holding up the bag of food they had brought. "We have sandwiches and soup that's still warm." The mention of warm food caused a visible reaction among the 3 teenagers. Sarah, who had been trying to maintain a tough exterior, let her guard down enough to nod eagerly. As they shared the meal, the teenagers gradually began to tell their stories. Jake had aged out of foster care and lost his job when the restaurant where he worked closed down. Tommy had run away from an abusive home situation. Sarah had been kicked out by her family when she came out as gay. Each story was different in its details, but they all shared common themes of abandonment, desperation, and the daily struggle to survive on the streets. "The thing is," Jake said as he finished his sandwich, "we don't want handouts. We want to work, to make our own way. But nobody will hire you when you don't have an address, when you can't take a shower or do laundry regularly." "That's exactly what our program is designed to address," Alyssa explained. "We provide transitional housing so you have a safe place to stay while you get back on your feet. We help with job placement, education, whatever you need to build a stable life." "And what do you want in return?" Sarah asked suspiciously. "There's always a catch." Sophie leaned forward, her voice gentle but earnest. "The only thing we ask is that you be honest with us about what you need and that you're willing to work toward your goals. We're not here to judge you or control you. We're here to support you." "I was living under this same bridge 6 months ago," Sophie continued. "I know what it's like to be cold and hungry and scared. These people found me and helped me without asking for anything except the chance to treat me like a human being." The three teenagers exchanged glances, and Alyssa could see the internal debate playing out on their faces. Hope warring with skepticism, desperation fighting against pride. "If we come with you tonight," Tommy asked quietly, "and we don't like it, can we leave?" "Of course," Marcus replied immediately. "You're not prisoners. You're people who deserve support and respect." An hour later, Alyssa watched as Jake, Tommy, and Sarah settled into the center's emergency housing facility, a converted apartment building that provided short-term accommodations while longer-term solutions were developed. Each teenager had been assigned a caseworker who would work with them to develop individualized plans for housing, employment, and education. "3 more," Sophie said, as they locked up the center for the night. 3 more people who won't have to spend tonight wondering if they're safe. It never gets old, does it? Alyssa mused. That feeling of being able to make a real difference. As she drove home that night, Alyssa reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The decision to give leftover food to a homeless teenager had seemed insignificant at the time, just a simple act of human kindness that required no thought or planning. But that moment had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not only Sophie's life and her own, but the lives of dozens of young people who had found their way to the Laurent Foundation. The next morning brought news that would mark another milestone in the program's development. Alexander called Alyssa personally to inform her that the city council had voted unanimously to provide additional funding that would allow the foundation to triple its capacity over the next year. "They were particularly impressed with your presentation last week," Alexander told her. The council members said they had never seen such concrete evidence of program effectiveness combined with such genuine compassion for the population being served. "That's wonderful news," Alyssa replied, already thinking about how they could use the additional resources. "We'll be able to help so many more young people." "There's something else," Alexander continued. "The state government has been watching what we're doing here, and they're interested in using our model as a template for similar programs in other cities. They want to know if you would be willing to serve as a consultant for Gashi program development." The offer represented another leap forward in responsibility and scope, but Alyssa found that the prospect excited rather than intimidated her. "I would be honored," she said, "as long as we can maintain the quality and personal approach that makes our program effective." "That's exactly what they want to preserve," Alexander assured her. "They've studied our outcomes, and they understand that the success comes from treating each person as an individual rather than a case number." That afternoon, Alyssa stood in the center's main room, watching Sophie work with Maria on college application essays. The girl who had been painting birds in flight was now preparing to apply for art school, her confidence and hope restored through months of patient support and encouragement. Jake, Tommy, and Sarah had settled well into the program, with Jake already starting a part-time job at a local bookstore, and Tommy enrolled in GED classes. Sarah had connected with the center's LGBTQ+ support group and was working with a counselor to address the trauma from her family's rejection. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Sophie said, joining Alyssa by the window that overlooked the busy street outside. I think about all the people walking by out there who might be struggling with something, who might just need someone to see them and treat them with kindness. That's the ripple effect, Alyssa replied. Every person we help here goes back into the world with the understanding that compassion matters, that small acts of kindness can change everything. The conversation was interrupted by Marcus, who approached with a folder full of papers and an expression of barely contained excitement. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "We just got a call from a high school guidance counselor across town. She has a student who's been sleeping in his car for 3 weeks. Too proud to ask for help but clearly struggling. She told him about our program, and he wants to know if someone could meet with him." "Of course," Alyssa said immediately. "Who's available to do an outreach visit?" "Actually," Marcus said with a grin, "he specifically asked if he could meet with the woman who started the program. He's heard about your story, about how you helped Sophie, and he said he'd feel more comfortable talking to someone who understands what it means to care about strangers." As Alyssa gathered her materials for another outreach visit, she marveled at how her life had evolved. The scared waitress who had worried about making rent had become someone that troubled teenagers specifically requested to meet with. The woman who had once felt trapped by circumstances had found a way to help others escape their own traps. Later that evening, after successfully connecting the high school student with resources and support, Alyssa returned to the center to find Alexander waiting in her office. It was unusual for him to visit without advance notice, and she felt a moment of concern. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "More than all right," Alexander replied, gesturing for her to sit down. "I wanted to talk to you about something important. Sophie and I had been discussing the future of the foundation, and we have a proposition for you." Alyssa settled into her chair, curious about what they might have planned. "The success of this program has exceeded every expectation we had," Alexander continued. "The outcomes speak for themselves. But more than that, you've created something that truly embodies the values Sophie and I believe in. You've built a program that treats every person with dignity and respect." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "We want to offer you the position of Executive Director of the Laurel Foundation, with oversight of all our charitable programs. It would mean a significant increase in salary and responsibility, but more overall, importantly, it would give you the platform to expand this approach to helping people on a much larger scale." The offer was staggering in its implications. Executive Director of a foundation with resources that could impact thousands of lives, the opportunity to take the lessons they had learned working with homeless youth and apply them to other vulnerable populations. "What would happen to the youth program?" Alyssa asked. "Marcus is ready to step into the director role here," Alexander replied. "He has the experience and the vision to maintain everything you've built while continuing to grow the program. Sophie will continue her involvement as she completes her social work degree." Alyssa thought about the path that had led her to this moment, from serving coffee at Murphy's Diner to being offered leadership of a major philanthropic organization. It all traced back to a simple decision to share leftover food with a hungry teenager, to treat another human being with basic kindness and respect. "I accept," she said without hesitation. "But I want to maintain hands-on involvement with direct service. I never want to get so far removed from the people we're helping that I forget what this work is really about." Alexander smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything else from you. That connection to the human impact of what we do is exactly why you're the right person for this role." 6 months later, Alyssa stood at the podium of the city's largest conference center, addressing an audience of social workers, government officials, and philanthropists from across the region. The Laurent Foundation had become a model for innovative approaches to social services, and Alyssa found herself in demand as a speaker and consultant. And the key to effective social services, she told the audience, isn't complex programming or sophisticated technology. It's remembering that every person we serve is a human being with inherent dignity and worth. It's treating symptoms but also addressing root causes. Most importantly, it's believing that every person has the potential for positive change when given the right support and opportunities. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Sophie, now in her final year of social work school, sat in the front row taking notes. Marcus was there representing the youth program, which had expanded to serve over 200 young people annually. Even Frank Murphy had made the trip from the diner, beaming with pride at what his former waitress had accomplished. After the presentation, as Alyssa mingled with attendees and answered questions about program implementation, she was approached by a young woman who looked familiar but whom she couldn't quite place. "Ms. Rodriguez," the woman said, extending her hand. "My name is Jessica Chen. I don't know if you remember me, but I was one of the first people your program helped. I was sleeping in my car and working at a veterinary clinic." Recognition dawned, and Alyssa smiled warmly. "Jessica, of course I remember you. How are you doing?" "I'm fantastic," Jessica replied, her face glowing with happiness. "I just graduated from the veterinary technician program at the community college, and I'm starting a full-time position at Andaya Animal Hospital next month. But that's not why I wanted to talk to you." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "I wanted you to know that what you and your team did for me, it changed everything. But more than that, it taught me something important about how to treat other people. Last week, I saw a woman digging through the dumpster behind my apartment building. Instead of looking away or calling the police, I remembered how you treated me, with respect and kindness." Jessica's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I brought her some food and helped her connect with services in our area. She's doing better now, but the point is, I learned from you that we all have the power to make a difference in someone else's life. The kindness you showed me, it's still spreading, touching people you'll never even meet." As Alyssa drove home that evening, Jessica's words echoed in her mind. This was the true measure of success, not the statistics or the awards or the recognition, but the ripple effects of compassion that continued to spread long after the initial act of kindness. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Sophie, calling with excitement in her voice. "Alyssa, you're not going to believe this," Sophie said. "I just got accepted to graduate school for my master's in social work. But that's not the best part. They offered me a research assistantship to study innovative approaches to homeless services. They specifically mentioned the Laurent Foundation model as something they want me to help develop and refine." "That's wonderful, Sophie," Alyssa said, genuinely thrilled for the young woman who had come so far from the desperate teenager she had met behind Murphy's diner. "You're going to make such a difference in this field." "I learned from the best," Sophie replied. "Everything I know about treating people with dignity and respect, I learned from watching you work." As she ended the call and pulled into her driveway, Alyssa reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. The small apartment had been replaced by a comfortable house, the financial stress had been eliminated, and the sense of being trapped by circumstances had been transformed into a feeling of unlimited possibility. But the most important change wasn't material. It was the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that her work mattered, that every day brought opportunities to make a real difference in people's lives. The scared, tired waitress who had handed leftover food to a homeless girl had discovered that acts of kindness, no matter how small they might seem, had the power to transform not just individual lives but entire communities. The Laurent Foundation now operated programs in 12 cities, serving thousands of people annually, while maintaining the personal, dignity-centered approach that had made the original youth program so successful. Alyssa traveled frequently, helping other communities implement similar programs, but she always returned to the original center, to the direct service work that kept her grounded in the human reality behind the statistics and reports. 2 years later, on a cold November evening, remarkably similar to the night she had first met Sophie, Alyssa found herself back in the alley behind Murphy's diner. The foundation was hosting a fundraising event at a nearby hotel. But she had stepped out for some fresh air and found her feet carrying her to the place where everything had started. Frank had kept Murphy's running, much as it had always been. Though he now proudly displayed a framed newspaper article about Alyssa's success on the wall behind the register, the diner remained a gathering place for working-class families, construction crews, and anyone looking for honest food at fair prices. As she stood in the alley, remembering that pivotal night, Alyssa heard a familiar sound, soft crying, coming from near the dumpster. Her heart raced as she turned toward the sound. wondering if history was about to repeat itself. A young man, probably 19 or 20, sat with his back against the brick wall, his head in his hands. His clothes were worn but clean, and a military-style backpack sat beside him. As she approached carefully, he looked up with eyes that held the same mixture of desperation and dignity she had seen in Sophie years before. "Are you okay?" Alyssa asked gently. The same words she had spoken to Sophie. The young man wiped his eyes, embarrassed to be seen in his vulnerable moment. "I'm sorry, I didn't think anyone would be back here. I'll move along." "You don't have to move," Alyssa said, settling onto a nearby crate at a respectful distance. "What's your name?" "David," he replied hesitantly. "David Rodriguez. I just got back from deployment overseas, and things haven't gone exactly as planned." The coincidence of the shared last name wasn't lost on Alyssa, but she focused on the young veteran's obvious distress. "What kind of things?" David's story emerged slowly, told in halting sentences punctuated by long pauses. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, returning home with PTSD and physical injuries that made it difficult to maintain steady employment. The Veterans Administration services were backlogged, his benefits were delayed, and he had exhausted his savings waiting for assistance that seemed perpetually delayed by bureaucracy. "I've been staying at a motel, but I ran out of money 3 days ago," David explained. "I'd been sleeping in my car, but it broke down this morning. I came back here because it's quiet, and I needed a place to think about what to do next." Alyssa listened with the same focused attention she had given Sophie, recognizing the shame and frustration that came with circumstances beyond one's control. "David, I work with an organization that helps people in situations like yours. We have resources specifically for veterans, and we might be able to help you access the services you've been waiting for." She pulled out her business card, the same gesture Alexander had made with her years before. "My name is Alyssa Rodriguez, and I'm the executive director of the Laurent Foundation. We have partnerships with veteran service organizations, and we've had success helping people navigate the system to get the benefits they've earned." David stared at the card, then looked up at her with confusion. "You're the director of a foundation, and you're here in an alley talking to me?" "Everyone deserves to be heard," Alyssa said simply. "And sometimes, the most important conversations happen in unexpected places." As they talked, Alyssa found herself thinking about the cyclical nature of compassion, how acts of kindness created ripples that eventually returned to their source. She was no longer the struggling waitress who had helped Sophie, but she remained the same person who believed that everyone deserved dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. "Would you be willing to come with me to the Foundation Center?" she asked David. "Even if it's just for tonight, so you have a warm place to sleep while we figure out your next steps?" David hesitated, the same internal struggle between pride and necessity that Alyssa had witnessed so many times before. "I don't want charity," he said finally. "I just want the chance to get back on my feet." "That's exactly what we provide," Alyssa assured him. "Not charity, but support while you build the life you want. The same kind of support that any person deserves when they're facing difficult circumstances." An hour later, as David settled into the Foundation's emergency housing facility, Alyssa reflected on the strange symmetry of the evening. In helping David, she had come full circle to the moment that had transformed her own life. The alley behind Murphy's Diner had once again been the site of a chance encounter that would change the trajectory of someone's future. Over the following months, David became one of the Foundation's most successful placements. With the help of their Veteran Services Coordinator, he was able to access his delayed benefits, receive treatment for his PTSD, and eventually find employment with a construction company that valued his military experience and work ethic. More importantly, he became an advocate for other veterans facing similar challenges, volunteering his time to help navigate the complex systems that had once seemed impossibly complicated. The Laurent Foundation continued to grow and evolve, always maintaining its core principle of treating every person with dignity and respect. Sophie completed her master's degree and joined the Foundation's leadership team, bringing her unique perspective as someone who had experienced both the desperation of homelessness and the power of compassionate. Intervention. Alexander remained actively involved in the Foundation's work, but he had stepped back from day-to-day operations to focus on his media empire and other philanthropic interests. His relationship with Sophie had been fully repaired, stronger now for having weathered the crisis that had nearly torn them apart. Their shared commitment to the Foundation's mission had given them a common purpose that transcended the generational and cultural differences that had once divided them. 5 years after that first night behind Murphy's Diner, the Laurent Foundation had become a national model for innovative social services. Alyssa found herself testifying before congressional committees about effective approaches to homelessness, consulting with other cities on program development, and speaking at conferences around the country about the power of dignity-centered services. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Murphy's Diner received a visit from the mayor, who presented Frank with a community service award recognizing the restaurant as the birthplace of one of the city's most successful charitable programs. The award ceremony was small and informal, attended by Foundation staff, local residents, and the many people whose lives had been touched by the work that had started in the alley behind the diner. "It's funny how things work out," Frank said, as he accepted the award. Alyssa always had a good heart, always treated everyone with respect whether they were ordering a $5 meal or just needed someone to listen. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that she found a way to turn that kindness into something bigger. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Alyssa found herself once again standing in the alley where it all began. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Sophie stood beside her, now 23 years old and confident in her career as a social worker and advocate. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't stopped that night?" Sophie asked. Alyssa considered the question, thinking about all the lives that had been changed by that single moment of compassion. "I think someone else would have helped you eventually," she said finally. "You're too strong and too determined to have stayed lost forever." "Maybe," Sophie replied. "But it might have taken much longer, and I might not have learned the lessons I needed to learn about accepting help and treating others with kindness." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of the city around them. The alley looked much the same as it had 5 years before, but everything else had changed in ways that would have been impossible to imagine on that cold November night when two strangers had encountered each other in the darkness. "The Foundation is planning to open a new program for families experiencing homelessness," Sophie said. "I was thinking we should base it here. Maybe convert some of the buildings on this block into transitional housing." "That's a beautiful idea," Alyssa replied, coming full circle to where it all started. As they walked back toward the street, passing the dumpster where Sophie had once searched for food, both women carried with them the profound understanding that small acts of kindness, offered freely and without expectation, possessed the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The ripples of compassion that had started with leftover food and a $20 bill continued to spread, touching lives in ways that would never be fully measured or completely understood. The story that had begun with a desperate teenager and a tired waitress had become something much larger, a testament to the fundamental truth that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, and that sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. In a world that often seemed divided by differences of class, background, and circumstance, the Laurent Foundation stood as proof that compassion could bridge any gap, and that the power to make a difference in someone else's life was available to anyone willing to see the humanity in others. Years later, when people asked Alyssa about the secret to the Foundation's success, her answer was always the same. "We remember that every person we serve is someone's child, someone who matters, someone who deserves the chance to build a better life. When you start from that understanding, everything else follows naturally." The leftover food that had started it all had long since been consumed, but the nourishment it provided, both physical and spiritual, continued to sustain a growing network of people who had learned that kindness was not only possible, but essential, not only valuable, but transformative, and not only needed but capable of changing the sea trains. World one person, one moment, one act of compassion at a time.